So hello, my name is Emma Johnston. I'm an analyst in the Safety, Culture, and Governance section at the California Public Utilities Commission. And this is our third technical working group meeting for the proceeding R21-10-001. The goal of this meeting is to talk about options for the safety culture assessment schedule and process. So the timing of assessments and what the general follow-up and process will be for those assessments. We're going to start off just with some quick welcome and introduction. We provide this overview in all of the presentations so far, but this is just letting everyone know that the goal of this proceeding is to develop and adopt a safety culture assessment framework and process for the regulated IOUs in fulfillment of SB 901. And this is our second to last working group meeting for this summer. So the last one will be next Thursday. Here's a list of the scoping questions that we're going to try to address within this meeting. So the three questions are, should the safety culture assessments be scheduled so that the implementation of the assessment recommendations are considered in utilities ramp applications and general rate cases? How and when should utilities that completed a safety culture assessment in recent years be required to comply with the process developed through this proceeding? And how should the Commission ensure that the safety culture assessment process developed through this proceeding is complementary to and not duplicative of the annual process for assessments conducted by the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety? Here's an overview of our agenda for today. So we're going to just have a couple of presentations today. You might have seen that the meeting is likely going to end at 3 or a little bit earlier. So a little bit earlier than I think we had previously said 4. And then I'm just going to go over some virtual housekeeping rules really quickly. So as you heard, this meeting is being recorded, and as with the previous meetings, we'll distribute the recording and the slides to the service list after the meeting. We've also been posting them on the Safety Policy Division website. So if you have to step out, then don't worry, because there's a recording. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat. We'll also have Q&A sessions throughout the presentations, and then like the other workshops, we'll have a longer discussion at the end. We'll also try to follow up with any unanswered questions that we don't get to. To be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to try to maintain our goal start and ending time, so 1 to 3, and try to stick to the timing within the agenda. And then just noting that we do have that last workshop, so next week. So any of the additional topics that we didn't cover within this workshop, we'll get to at that last workshop. We also have IT support here, so if you have any IT issues, then you can feel free to contact any of our support members here. And then this is just another virtual housekeeping slide in case you're unfamiliar with WebEx. Your mute and unmute buttons are at the bottom of your screen, along with your raise hand function. So you can use the raise hand function if you have a question. And then sometimes the chat bar gets hidden, but if you click the chat on the right hand side of your screen, then you'll be able to see that. And then I think I already said this, but since it's a virtual meeting, just make sure that you're muted if you're not speaking so that we don't receive any feedback from you. I think we're actually going to skip opening remarks. Commissioner Houck had another commitment, so she is running a little bit late, but once she joins, I will pause and allow her to say hello. So I'm going to pass it on to the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, Sarah Moore, to give this first presentation on Energy Safety's annual safety culture assessment process. So Sarah, I will kick it off to you.
Thank you, Emma. I'm pleased to join you today. I'm an wildfire safety analyst at the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, or as we call it, Energy Safety. And we were tasked with the execution of an annual safety culture assessment of the electrical corporations, specifically looking at safety culture in a wildfire mitigation setting. Can you advance the slide, please? So this is grounded in legislation and that produced a new chapter of this Public Utility Code that asks us to create a process with the CPUC for an annual safety culture assessment for each electrical corporation. And we do this by submitting a process document to the CPUC in the fall, which is then reviewed and so far has been ratified in December, and then we proceed with our process for the coming year. This is an annual thing that we will continue to do. Next slide, please. So this is a continuous learning process. We are not trying to go to the utilities and give them, violation notifications for every accident they have. That's not our game with these safety culture assessments. We're trying to foster a climate of transparency and learning and shared lessons learned and best practices. And that is asserted in a process document from 2020, the WSD 11, attachment 4, if you want to read the original intention. And additionally, we provide these reports with recommendations every year to the electrical corporations, in part so that if they choose, they can agree to implement these recommendations and thereby be considered to be in good standing for the purposes of applying for a safety certification. I'm not going to go into describing the safety certification process or the other elements to it, but just to say that the safety culture assessment and energy safety provides that avenue for establishing good standing to electrical corporations that wish to have a safety certification. Next slide. At the moment, our safety culture assessment is comprised of a workforce survey that's targeted at frontline workers who are engaged in wildfire mitigation activities that are specifically the activities described in the wildfire mitigation plan that we receive from the corporations every year. And it also includes an element of a self-assessment that's targeted towards the management of the company, that they answer 22 questions that are structured along a safety culture maturity model to indicate where they are in their progress on these 22 elements. We also ask, as part of that, for a summary plan for safety culture for the coming year. And additionally, we are following up last year and this year with the large IOUs that are required to complete the management self-assessment to do an interview to ask them questions about anything that was unclear on their responses. And then, in addition, to follow up on the workforce survey, we're last year and this year again doing focus groups to talk to frontline workers and frontline supervisors to see if we can understand better the context in which they are responding to the workforce survey. Additionally, we ask for safety culture objectives for the coming year and for 3 years from the time of responding. And we're asking for lessons learned since the last safety culture assessment and updates on last year's recommendations. What implementation steps have been taken and what results have been identified. And those two elements, the safety culture objectives and lessons learned, are required of the large IOUs, the small and multi-jurisdictional utilities, and the independent transmission operators. That is the only element that's required all of the electrical corporations. Next slide, please. In response to the recommendations that are provided by our third-party contractor, we ask for the utilities to give us quarterly notification updates. There's a quarterly notification that goes to the safety certification service list that includes several elements, including updates on activities related to the wildfire mitigation plan, any decisions made or recommendations made by the safety oversight board of each corporation, and what progress has been made on the recommendations. When the recommendations are made, we review them to make sure that they are verifiable recommendations. They're not just, oh, get better, but get better on this by this time and this to demonstrate X. And with that, I think I've given a pretty general but clear overview. I would field any questions if anybody has any.
Could I ask just a quick question on the verifiable recommendations? How do you tell them you want them to be verifiable? Do you agree on a mode of verification?
Well, at least this is our second year doing this. So this is something that is, among other things, going to be improved over time. But last year, when we issued the recommendations, we made sure they all had some step that was verifiable, some output that we could check in the coming year, including change for the better on the workforce survey on questions X, Y, and Z, like specific questions on the workforce survey that the responses caused us concern, and we'd like to see improvement on those questions. That was a common kind of verifiable outcome that we're looking for. Or not outcome, but output, like some indicator that we can look for in the coming year. Was there, I think there may have been a last slide with just, did I have a pretty, yeah, here's our slogan, our contact information. My email I can put in the chat if people have specific questions they want to send to me later.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'll pause just for another second to see if there's any other questions or raised hands in the chat or on our screen, and then we can move on to our next presentation. But thank you for presenting, Sarah. All right, with that, I will move on to our next presentation, which is going to be the Safety Policy Division's proposal for assessment timing, frequency, and coordination with other CPUC activities. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Rich White, for this presentation.
Great, thank you, Emma. I appreciate it. I'm looking at the list of participants, and I see a lot of people names that I recognize from many of the utilities, from different organizations. So hello to everybody that I know, and hello to all the people that I don't know. And it's nice to meet you virtually. So today I'm going to talk about the Safety Policy Division's proposal for safety culture assessments, the timing, and how that timing actually can facilitate kind of learning and improvement in safety culture over time. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we started with was some basic assumptions about safety culture assessment process. We've talked to a number of different utilities. We've talked to a number of different regulators who have implemented safety culture regulation, a number of different researchers all over. And there are some fundamental things which keep popping up. And one of those is that safety culture is really owned by each entity. They're the owner of their own safety culture. But at the same time, we've also found that safety culture is actually a public good. It's something that the public has an interest in. Whenever there's a major event, the public can be impacted by any sort of catastrophic event. So we have a little bit of a dichotomy between a utility owning their own safety culture, but it also being a public good. At the same time, safety culture science has identified specific areas, as Dr. Cooper has called them, broken safety cultures. There are a number of different organizations and entities that have identified similar cultures. Some of the definitions are slightly different, but they're essentially very similar, and these domains have been well known and identified by many different organizations. That at the same time, safety culture science is still immature and it's evolving. There's a number of heated debates. People who have been on previous meetings have heard some of the debates between the different practitioners. So there's really a bit of an evolution happening right now. And I think we're at the forefront of something I think that is very interesting. We're actually trying to implement a new regulatory process that's actually going to develop a safety culture within utilities that is we know to be kind of improving over time. And at the same time, I think we all recognize that learning and engagement and sort of a continuous improvement process are essential elements in safety cultures, as Sarah mentioned. So next slide, please. So the CPUC has engaged a consultant to develop a maturity model for safety culture. And their model has been developed in 3 tiers. Tier 1 is essentially a very high level assessment level where you're just identifying behaviors and actions and characteristics for over a set of domains. They've developed 10 functional domains over which maturity can be assessed. Tier 2 is really what I think of as the best practices for each of those domains. And so they describe kind of the attributes associated with each of those 10 domains. And then the tier 3 level are measures associated with each of those attributes. So it really develops a process for assessing, approving, and measuring safety culture. And the key feature here, I think, is the improvement part. There's really a path. This sort of modeling paradigm identifies steps to improve safety culture over time. And so that's been kind of our foundation when we thought about what kind of process would make sense and what kind of timeline would make sense for doing assessments. So next slide, please. So foundational to kind of our proposal is sort of the learning process. And so we've thought about building in kind of this feedback loop where on year 1, a comprehensive assessment can be taken, but that comprehensive assessment doesn't act by itself. It also goes into learning about how well the maturity model and the safety culture model itself is working. And so after each year of a comprehensive assessment, we believe that kind of updates to the model are appropriate. In the following years, the IOUs would be doing self-assessments over year 2, 3, and 4. And in the 4th year, we'd do another comprehensive assessment, update the maturity model. The utilities would then be using the updated maturity model for their assessments in the following years. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of the timeline of how that would work out. We're proposing a 4-year cycle. This is similar to the RAMP and GRC cycle. In the first year, we are proposing a baseline assessment that would be essentially like a tier 3 assessment in the motive power BSMS model paradigm. In the 4th year, there would be another assessment and then a model recalibration. And that model recalibration would take into account the types of things that the utilities did, gap analysis of what these assessments did and did not find, So the comprehensive assessment in the fourth year really is looking at a number of different things, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. Next slide. So we also believe that the third-party assessment also has to be accompanied with a self-assessment by the IOUs. Safety culture is really owned by the IOUs and not by the regulator. And so we believe imperative that a self-assessment is also performed by the each of the IOUs. In the first year, it's a bit of a startup problem. The utilities wouldn't necessarily have to do their own self-assessment since a comprehensive assessment has already been done. They could take the results of that. But what is important is that the IOUs really evaluate what that assessment means to them, essentially do a risk assessment of that report, of the comprehensive report, and then develop a plan for improvement. And we believe that result from the utilities, what they've determined to be the highest priority items in their plan for the next year should be reported to the PUC every year. Next slide, please. And this would continue every year. So throughout the cycle, each year the utility would do a self-assessment. They'd update their action plan and they continue on their improvement path. And each year this would be reported to the commission, so that there's clearly a record of the types of things that the utilities have been doing, the types of the effectiveness of those particular actions in terms of their self-assessment. Each year these self-assessments will be changing. So there's a number of things that are being tracked, but at the same time, these are not things that are being implemented by the CPUC. They're really owned by each IOU. Each IOU is coming up with its own game plan, its own action plan, implementing its own action plan. They're really simply reporting to the PUC. Next slide. So the comprehensive assessments based on the maturity model, we estimate that a comprehensive assessment would take approximately 6 months. This will include interviews, focus groups, surveys, document reviews, observations, and also gap analysis. And this is really to try and understand not only what the utilities had done, but understand if there were anything that was not captured by the models that perhaps the utilities could have done. So we want to identify blind spots that these annual assessments may have missed. And this also allows the CPUC to look at the model itself and determine whether or not the maturity model is actually functioning as we would like it to do. And it can identify other areas that we might want to enhance the model to focus on particular areas such as process safety or strategic safety or investment safety culture issues, and so on. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we think part of the continuous improvement process really is updating the maturity model as we go on a 4-year basis. So the comprehensive review would review the results of the assessment, and also do a recalibration of the model. I think of this really as kind of a software update, moving from model version 3.2 to 3.3. Maybe in the first year it's moving from version 1 to version 2. But this isn't a wholesale revamping of the model. We've BSMS and Motive Power developed a model of safety culture along 10 functional domains. So we envision that the recalibration would be looking for where places within those 10 functional domains that could be enhanced, weaknesses of those 10 functional domains, or perhaps even identifying additional domains that have not been covered. The comprehensive assessment also looks at essentially an audit of the IOU's self-assessment. Looks back at what did the IOU assess and what did they find, and does that comport with what the independent reviewer actually find using the same methods. Next slide, please. So this is just a illustration of kind of that review, the comprehensive assessment. There's an audit of the self-assessments, and there's their gap analysis. And the audit and the gap analysis would produce a report assessing the quality of the self-assessments and indicating what gaps might occur. That also would feed into the maturity model recalibration, and then an updated maturity model would be developed. Again, moving from version 1 to version 2, or hopefully version 2 to 2.1. We don't anticipate major changes, but just really filling in gaps. Next slide, please. And for the annual assessments, the motive power BSMS model is built on a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 process. The utilities would have the option to determine whether they want to do tier 1 assessment, tier 2 assessment, tier 3 assessment. And again, it's the same process, but they could do a streamlined process. They could do a detailed, in-depth process. It really would be up to them. The main point is that the framework is the same year over year, assessing along the 10 domains, assessing along the best practices within each of those domains. And this provides consistency for over time, consistency for the utilities, and it also provides the utilities the opportunity to create a roadmap. So this is really helping to really build ownership within the utilities for their own safety culture, but also allowing the commission insight and transparency into what they're assessing and how they're assessing it. Next slide, please. So again, this is a little more detailed of how that self-assessment process could work. There's several different elements of the assessment. And one of the things that we've looked at and we need to develop some more work on is how to integrate other information. OEIS has been doing a number of different self-assessments for the utilities, and they've developed their model. We'd like to be able to leverage that information as best we can. Other safety management system audits, we'd like to be able to leverage that information as well. So we think that information should also be integrated. And that is a bit of a to be determined process to determine how that information is integrated, but we believe that there's that information should be evaluated in some way. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of options that we have for implementing this process. So when we start up, we need to determine when do we start the assessments for each of the utilities. The first comprehensive assessment and the annual assessments. Will all the utilities be doing a comprehensive assessment in the same year? Or could they be aligned with the ramp process? It's a little bit of a question right now. Next slide. So one option is to do a synchronized schedule. In this case, all of the utilities are essentially assessed in the same year. And this allows for annual assessments will then also be done in the intervening years. The comprehensive assessment is then done again in 2027, and model updates would then would occur at that time. That creates a little bit of a time gap between the comprehensive assessments and the model updates, essentially 4 years between model updates, but they'd all be consistent and be taking into account all the changes that occurred in all of the utilities. Next slide, please. And then there's the staggered assessment process, where the assessments are aligned with the ramp process. In this case, there would be a baseline assessment essentially now, and then after that, the comprehensive assessments would take place at the same year of the ramp. So some utilities would have an assessment perhaps in comprehensive assessment 2 years in a row, and another one maybe a gap of 2 years, and then a gap of 3 years. But this is a bit of a startup problem. But the benefit of that is obviously is that now that the comprehensive assessments are aligned with RAMP, they could be integrated into the GRC process, and kind of the best, latest information about where the utilities are would be available. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, coordination between RAMP and GRC is, a possibility when the comprehensive assessments are staggered. So we're very interested in hearing people's comments and thoughts. Let's see, I think we have a couple more slides. Next slide, please. Yes. So OEIS. So we've been meeting regularly with OEIS on many fronts. As I mentioned before, we'd like to leverage the information of the energy safety's work. We do have an existing MOU between the Energy Safety and CPUC to facilitate data sharing. I think all of these areas we're just beginning to build out. And I think there's a tremendous amount of coordination that we could benefit from, and the utilities could benefit from, by having a stronger coordination between our two models. And that's something we need to work out with OEIS and the utilities, really to find a good path forward in that data sharing and information sharing process. So with that, I will open it up to questions. I think that's our last slide. I think we're doing at really a lightning pace today, which is a good thing for Friday. But it also leaves us some extra time for discussion, which I think is really an important part of the technical working group meetings. So I'll throw it back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Rich. If you have questions, and you can feel free to type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Thank you. Paul, I saw your hand first. Go ahead.
Okay, I think that's a very impressive and thoughtful approach to take. I have two questions. One relates to the role of the comprehensive safety culture assessment to create a baseline. This seems to me to be a sort of putting the cart partially before the horse here. I mean, part of the process of safety culture development is to figure out how well it can be assessed and how to do that. And so while I know there'll be a third-party assessor, it seems to me that this to be really a comprehensive assessment requires more knowledge about what a safety culture that functions well will look like in that utility than can be assumed to begin with. I don't know I know there are models of safety culture, but one of the things you can ask, it seems to me that's important, is you can talk about the areas of assessment. Do individuals challenge assumptions and offer opposing views? For example, when they believe something's not correct, that's often taken as some measure of or issue in safety culture. It's a behavioral one, but then you have to ask, well, how is this known? How would you know this? And in a sense, the prior issue of determining a baseline assessment would be partly to figure out how to know these things and have people in the utilities participate in what would be a good method of assessing some of these safety culture elements. So I think you could rush this process a little bit and then get stuck with a baseline that is not really necessarily an accurate or valid way of judging the existing safety culture. So I mean, I think that was one issue. One other just quick thought is you seem to want to avoid duplication between the Cpuc safety culture assessment and those done by the Office of Energy and Infrastructure Safety. I think you could make a case for actually having some overlap in order to test the validity of each of the approaches. Again, part of this process of assessment is dependent on learning about what safety culture elements make sense in particular utility and checking the methods of assessment. And so it seems to me you don't want complete duplication, but it actually could be instructive as a learning process to have some overlap between the separate assessments just to see if you get a good match and have some good foundation to assuming the validity of the process. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Paula. It's very interesting comments. I hadn't thought about it quite that way. So the baseline, and Dr. Cooper's on the line, so I want to get his comments too, because he knows much more about the assessment measurement process and how that was developed. But so 2 points. One is, I think we recognize that any model that we propose is not going to be complete today. You know, we do have that 4-year cycle for recalibration. So we're aware that the model may not be perfect today and that there are going to be issues that we need to address. So that's the first point. The second point of doing a baseline study, I think today is sort of a sense of let's get started. You know, let's put a stake in the ground somewhere. That may not be 1000% accurate and precise in understanding safety culture, even though safety culture is not necessarily very, very well defined in my mind. So we have those two problems of the definition of safety culture being a bit nebulous. Safety culture is kind of a immature science, as I say. And then also of wanting to get started. And so I view it as, let's put a stake in the ground. Let's see where we are. Let's make our first run and see where we go, see where we are going forward. And we do have built in that 4 years down the road of this recalibration piece. It is a bit of a challenge in the regulatory environment because I know many of the parties will want to know, what are we going to do and what do we have to do? And so it's going to take, I think, some of the parties really accepting something that's a little bit different from a regulatory standpoint of saying that, of really buying into a process of learning and moving forward with a process that's a learning process and really committing to that. So those are my thoughts, and I'll throw it over to Dr. Cooper if he has any other comments on kind of the modeling aspect and the baseline issues.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Dr. Shulman. I thought it was a great question and some great points. And it touches on the reliability and validity of the measures and the different methods, but as well as the entire process and the assessment process, which I think is brilliant. I think part of the problem with safety culture world and work is reliability and validity has been overlooked in many quarters. So each of the methods that we would propose, so for example, where we got quantification there, which would be the maturity model, any safety climate scores and so on and so forth, you could use Cronbach's alpha internal to get the reliability, because if you don't have reliability of a method, you can't have validity. The two are together. So the first things you're going to have to work out is the reliability of each of these methods. With the quants, you can do it using Cronbach's alpha. With the qualitative, then you're going to have to use things like inter-observer reliability, inter-coder reliability of text on interviews and those kinds of things. And only when you've worked out your reliability, and presumably you would be also somewhere down the line putting this against each of the IOU's performance metrics, whether they're process safety metrics or personal injury metrics. So you would want to know what the reliability of that data is as well before you can even attempt any kind of validation. Each of the methods can also be validated, and you're aware, and I'm aware, that there's half a dozen of this and half a dozen of that kind of validity, and there's face validity, content validity, discriminant validity, and current validity, predictive validity, and so on and so forth. And I'm a great fan of exploring all of those with all of these methods, because that will show us what doesn't work and isn't adding value, and that could be dropped. That's part of this recalibration, this validation process. So if a method that's being used in amongst all of this is not adding value, then arguably you would drop it. As academics, you might say, well, hang on, give us another 10 years, we'll work on it and we'll make it work. But there you go. So I think it's a really good thing. I think I'm glad you raised the issue, and I think it's good to make everyone aware that what we're trying to do with our model, you'll see Rich raised the assess, improve, and measure, the three tiers. So all of those things are built in, one, to get to the reliability and the validity. We already know from some of the calibration exercises in that with the tier one, where we interviewed 60 odd people from IOUs, and it was a divorce process, so the interviewers didn't know anything about outcome statistics, and the person who knew about the outcome statistics, which was me, didn't know anything about the interview. So we were handed the data, and then when we did our reliability statistics, the outcome data for all the IOUs together was 0.61. The reliability of the interview data was 0.64. And then when we worked out the validity, we got negative. We did it by region. So we had people from each region, had 29 regions. And when we did that, we got a correlation of a negative 0.72. So where we had a good high score on the interviews for the maturity model, we had lower, the regions correspondingly had a lower outcome scores. And we did look at trying to split process safety, personal injury, and so on. And again, when you look into the process safety metrics, you can see that some of those are within the control of people in the IOUs and some are not. So where you've got, for example, gas diggings or intrusions, that's to do with other people, contractors, other people, and likewise with the wires and the transmission wires. You've got people bumping into poles and knocking them over. So you've got public, I'm just trying to make the point, there's public issues and there's internal control issues. And from the data that we did, we've learned that actually we need to start looking for some valid, reliable process safety metrics. And when I went and researched the literature, there isn't any that are linked to any of the maturity models or safe culture per se. And I think I found 5, if I'm right. One of them might be, for example, control room alarms. Is that a good indicator of process
So,
safety?
yes.
Se?
So I just wanted
Brilliant.
to jump in for a minute, just for folks who may not be familiar with a bit of the process, is that as the model was being developed, um, BSMS did collect data from each of the utilities, and some of the folks are on there from those utilities are on the call today. Did collect data from each of the utilities and essentially calibrated the model based on actual information using the safety performance metrics that were disaggregated into different regions and zones for each of the utilities. So we do have some understanding of the quality of the model at this point. As I say, it's been calibrated based on actual safety performance metric data provided to Dr. Cooper from the utilities. So we have a starting point. Can it be better? Absolutely. Will it be better? I hope so. And I think we do have a process for updating. You know, as we mentioned, there's the 4-year formal process. I don't believe that the CPU staff or the SPD staff is going to be waiting to look at details of how the model is performing. We're going to be evaluating different ways to improve the model as we go, as soon as this is moving forward.
Thanks, Rich. I wanted to pass it on to Tom, who has his hand raised.
Yep, just some quick questions. Is there any way to get additional data on the 10 domain model so that we can contemplate that right now? And then secondly, if the collaborative approaches that were listed in the concept paper #1, if that were to sort of unfold, what do you see as the timing on some of that with respect to the timetable you just put up? You know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so so next week there'll be another workshop, and we'll be going into more details on the safety culture maturity model that Dominic Cooper has developed. And so we'll be discussing the 10 domains in a bit more detail. And your second question again? Not quite sure I followed your second part of your question.
You laid out like, say, the first year would be a comprehensive third-party assessment, and then the annual. Where do you see the collaborative approaches, you know, all the various meetings? When does that? How do you see that intertwined?
So we didn't address that specifically in this presentation. That's a great point. But one of the things that I think is very important about Dr. Cooper's approach is that he's defined a framework of 10 functional domains that will be used by essentially all the utilities. And so now we have a common language, we have a common scale, so to speak, that allows for kind of better communication. The actual process for facilitating that communication we have not identified, but by creating this common language, I think we've gone a long way to building a process and a standard way to communicate information about safety culture that is actually reliable and understandable, and also scalable. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that kind of collaboration piece is something that we have not addressed in detail here, but I think we do have the underlying framework to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Rich. I'm going to pass it on to Jason next.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I had a couple questions. The first was on the annual self-assessment. Have you thought about, will that be a structure that would use kind of a safety policy division proposed structure, or is the intent to leverage some of the assessment activities that the utilities already undertake? So in other words, is it going to be a very specific self-assessment structure every year, or is there any thought to how we might be able to leverage some of the work that the utilities already undertake in that space? And then my other question is, and maybe this is something you'll cover next week, but what will the assessment outputs look like? So how specific will they be in terms of informing forward-looking learning and improvement opportunities? I'm just curious kind of what we should expect in that regard.
So let me give you a couple of my thoughts, and Dr. Cooper can also weigh in. He knows a little bit more about the outputs and how the outputs will be structured. But again, so the fundamental thing that the model has really developed is this structure about discussing safety culture related issues along the lines of 10 domains. It's 10 functional domains. So the work that you've done can be categorized, in my view, along those 10 domains. So I don't think there's the work that you've done is I think there is an alignment. It will take some work to align the work that you've done with the framework that Dr. Cooper has developed, but I don't think we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I think Dr. Cooper's work is really based on a traditional framework, a framework that have been used by many different organizations and entities. And so I'm very confident that what the utilities have been doing is transferable to this framework. And I think it's maybe a bit of a startup problem of doing the translation, but I don't think everything that's done is really for naught. I'll throw it over to Dr. Cooper on the second part of the question.
Yeah. Hi, Justin. Good questions. Just to put some of my responses in context, I've been doing this work for over 3 decades now in roughly 64 countries. So with different tools, and I've tried all of the interviews and surveys and all sorts of different things. So what we've been able to do is the way that the scoring system would work, for example, on the maturity model, there's different bands. A lot of the maturity models will go on using percentage, say from 0 to 100, so percentiles or percentages. You would go from the first band would be 20% to 40%, 40%, 60%, 60% to 80, and so on. We were able over the decades to collect enough data to be able to compute reliable percentile scores. So the banding that we would use, for example, it goes from or have used is from 0 to 30, then 31 to 60, 61 to 80, 80 to 90, 91 through 100. So it's kind of done the scoring, the percentiles work. The closer you get to the top, the harder it is to improve, so that any improvements is more likely to be a genuine improvement. So you could get a score, an overall score, if you like, because it's quantified against that maturity model and kind of show you where you are on that continuum from 0 through to 100. You could do that for different divisions, for different regions, for example, senior executives, for middle layer management, for employees, and so on. However you want to carve up the data in terms of demographics, that can be presented. We presented these in graphs, we've done them as radar graphs, and so on and so forth. For me, I would say that on a personal journey, the most valuable way of treating the data has been to run multiple regressions to try and identify the top 3 or 4 focus areas that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. What is it that's accounting for all of these scores? Where's the variance coming from? So, for example, we can talk about safety leadership and say, oh, hey, look, safety leadership as the number 1 issue, followed closely by, I don't know, communications and competence. Okay, so as an IOU, that's where we should focus our efforts, because we're going to have a wider impact on the other functional domains too, notwithstanding that the functional domains are highly interlinked with one another. They're discrete labels, but they're actually all highly interlinked. So there's various ways of doing the data. Again, in terms of that the existing work, I support everything that Richard's just said. I think that's really good to make you leverage the existing work. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to be able to take the work that you're already doing and put you're examining already into those functional domains, bringing them together. And again, I'm sure if you've quantified, so if you've done the safety surveys, you've got quantification already. How is that data treated? How is that reported back to you? What are you doing to analyze it? Do you get that data, or is it third-party assessor? I don't know exactly what you're all doing. But all I can say to you at the end of the day, with this data, you can present it in normal business statistics. So because you're trying to answer the question, where are you now? And then you want to know, well, where are we now? Where do we want to get to? What have we got to improve? And then how are we going to get there? So then that's where your bits and pieces come in as to what you're going to do, how you're going to measure it, how you know you're making progress, and so on.
And
so, as Richard said, it's a very traditional approach.
Yeah, and let me follow up on that. The way I think about Dom's model, the key word is functional. You know, and I look at the outputs. One of the key of the outputs of understanding your strengths and weaknesses. And so the question that you're really looking at is, it's almost like the model produces a portfolio of safety culture strengths and weaknesses. And the choices that you then make is really, what are you going to do with that portfolio? Where are you going to focus your efforts? And so you're getting a portfolio of safety culture, nuggets. And then you can allocate those nuggets wherever you need to do to strengthen those.
Thanks, Rich. Duncan had a question.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, just Duncan Hasselt, Motive Power. Quick clarification, I think, on just one little note that Rich made regarding the description of the model. Rich, thanks for calling out kind of the three tiers. I would just add, Tier 1 and Tier 2 are increasingly detailed maturity models designed around these 10 functional domains. The Tier 3, we continue to refer to it as a model, but Tier 3 is really a suite of 100+ indicators that have been designed fully aligned to each of the functional domains that can be leveraged by either the PUC or utilities to track progress on initiatives to improve safety culture on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. There's a combination of leading, current, and lagging indicators in that, like I say, all fully aligned to everything that's been measured by the maturity model, but slightly different sort of functional use for the content of Tier 3 than Tiers 1 and 2. And just quickly jumping off the back of the responses to Jason, your comment, Rich, delighted to hear you reference the portfolio management piece of this. I'm a sort of project programs and portfolios guy, and that's been very much my thinking as we've developed this model is, how can it be used by utilities, and how can we use the inputs to kind of help structure the good work that you're all currently doing. And portfolio management comes to me as sort of the natural way to draw together potentially some disparate things that are being done within utilities to improve safety, with the focus of the 10 domains that the maturity model brings.
Thank you, Duncan. We also got a question in the chat from Mike Walters, which was about if there was if there's a utility size cutoff for completing the assessments, given that some companies are a lot smaller. So Mike is from Pacificor and they have only 40 employees in California. Would they still have to complete the assessment? And I thank you, Mike, for this question, because we should have clarified at the beginning of the meeting that so this phase one of this proceeding is just thinking about the process and schedule for the large electric and gas utilities. And then in subsequent phases, we would think about how to modify and whether or not to adopt that process for the SMJUs and gas storage companies. But if Dr. Cooper, if you have thoughts on like what if the size of a utility determines what process should be used for the assessment, maybe that would be useful to answer, even though it's not technically within the scope of this current phase.
I would argue that everyone should be doing a safety culture assessment, no matter how large or small, because it's going to help them improve their safety performance. And if they think they're already good, they definitely need to do another safety culture assessment, just to make sure they are on track. So I think there's ways of doing it. I think it would have to be scaled down, that some of the proposals for the number of people involved, things like that, to suit. But I think in principle, I think it'd be a jolly good idea for the whole industry to walk in step from day one. That would be my personal view. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. And I just noticed that Commissioner Houck joined the meeting, so just wanted to say hi to Commissioner Houck. And if you wanted to say anything or say hello, then you can do that now. We're just doing our first question and answer session after the SPD presentation.
Thank you, Emma. I apologize for being late. There was another matter that went a little longer. I don't want to interrupt the flow of the discussion, but I'm looking forward to being able to hear the remaining part of the workshop, and we'll go back and get an update from staff and check the recording as well. So thank you, and I will be listening, and we'll turn it back over to Emma.
Thank you. So I got another question in the chat, which is, are there any scholarly articles on the functional domains by Dr. Cooper? So I will just pass that to Dr. Cooper. And before I pass it to him though, I would note that we'll have our second workshop that will be on the maturity model next week. And we anticipate also sending out additional materials after that second workshop that encompasses Technical Working Group 3 and Technical Working Group 4. But go ahead, Dr. Cooper, sorry.
Hi, okay, thank you for the question. There is a published paper in Safety Science, criterion related validity of the cultural web when assessing safety culture. And I believe it was published in 2019, and we had assessed a very large North American entity and held 15 focus group exercises, workshops, and we were able to relate the results back to a basket full of indicators. So we looked at the cultural web domains, and then we also, once we got the data, then we assigned it and themed it and put it into these 7 broken safety cultures, which is the main ones that have been linked to catastrophes, loss of containment studies, and impact safety climate work. And again, we have a website. I really wasn't here to advertise, but we have a website called behavioral-safety.com, which is how I got into doing safety 3 decades ago. But on there, on the front page, on the right-hand side, there's a document called, it's a safety culture review, navigating the safety culture construct. It was done in 2016 when we were going to take part in, or when we took part in the symposium of safety culture people in Granada in Spain, Andrew Hopkins and people like that. So, but there's a whole thing there. So that talks about the 7 broken safety culture features there as well, and why and what and how they're linked to process safety, disasters and the like. There's the other 3 that seem to be missing in my response to you are strategy, risk assessment, and CAPA, corrective and preventative actions. So we use those as a process, and what we're ideally looking for, or I would be looking for, is where the board or the senior executive team are going to risk assess the 7 broken safety cultures to see what their exposure is to the issues within those functional domains, and then come up with their corrective or preventive actions that feed into their strategy, their safety culture strategy, going forward. So we're very concerned that when you look at the safety culture field per se, there's very, very little on strategy. I think one of them who does would be Step Change for Safety in the oil and gas industry. But there's very little on it, but it's key to the whole process. It's about how do you get to where you're going to go. And I'm ex-military, and I know if you don't plan properly, well, you're not going to get to where you wanted to get to or achieve your objectives. So strategy is a part of that as well. But again, with risk assessment's a fundamental aspect of safety worldwide. It doesn't matter what safety management system you're looking at or what kind of certification system you're looking at. The whole thing of safety and OSH per se is predicated on risk assessment. So if we can get the IOUs, if you IOU guys can risk assess your exposure to profit before safety, to just cultures, to leadership, managerial non-compliance, lack of competence, lessons learned, and so on, then you're going to find out all of the things that could potentially lead you to experience a catastrophe. So ideally, hopefully. So if I would say, if you email Emma afterwards or Rich, get in touch with the CPUC, perhaps I can make up a list of papers if anyone wants them, for some of the work that's been done on this in the background.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Thanks, Dr. Cooper. I saw Matthew had his hand raised.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm Matthew Carley with Cal Advocates. I'm wondering, the 4-year cycle that SPD was sort of proposing, how do you contemplate allowing for reassessment, in response to ongoing events like safety failures? For example, if in year 2 of the cycle, there's, a major safety failure that shows an area that maybe the previous assessment had missed, how are we going to look back at that and incorporate that going forward? I don't think you'd want to wait, 3 more years for another major reassessment.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I think there are a couple of things, and I'm going to weigh on Dr. Cooper again for this a bit, is my view, understanding of safety culture is that it's a bit different from, sort of a specific incident. And it goes beyond a specific incident, and that it's really more of a long-term, in-depth, embedded kind of culture of an organization. So one specific incident, I'm not sure if there's something that is indicative of a model problem, but so I do think there's sort of this long-term aspect associated with safety culture, but we would have to, obviously we'd be looking at a particular problem. If a major incident occurred, we'd want to look at that and see if there are any sort of safety culture implications. Dr. Cooper, do you have any thoughts on kind of a specific incident and the need to recalibrate the model based on a specific incident or event?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's embedded in fact. If we go back to the Deepwater Horizon, a perception survey had been done, pulse survey, on the platform, and it did not predict the subsequent events. And I think it's a jolly good question. In terms of catastrophes, the measure that we're using, these 7 broken safety cultures are common features in most of the catastrophes that have happened since the 1970s in all sorts of different industries. So the likelihood of them not covering the issues that you might find in one incident would be unlikely, but certainly a possibility. I don't think, and I think Richard's right, one incident should skew the picture. I guess it depends how catastrophic it is and what everyone's thinking of knee-jerk reactions. But I think in terms of what it's measuring and what it's trying to do, it's on the right path. It can take up to 20 years to change a culture, because you're talking about social norms, you're talking about, so those are the values and the belief systems and how people view safety. Then you're also talking about the behavioural norms, which is what do we do in the IOUs? How do we behave every day when we go to do our tasks in relation to safety? But then also, what about the infrastructure and the situation? So we don't use environment in this model. We use the term situation because it's much wider than the physical infrastructure. It's also about the situation created by some of the market demands, by some of the leadership strategies, and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit wider. I think it be all I can say is, God forbid that anything like that does happen, that there is a catastrophe. But if there is, then I think a really good root cause analysis would help bottom out the issues. And then I think the CPUC and all of us would be very concerned to make sure that we compared the two to make sure that actually the model was on point. And again, look for any learning lessons that come out.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that we've discussed too, is the relationship between safety management systems and the safety culture assessments. And I think there's certainly some related safety management issues that might be more directly linked to an incident. But the other interesting thing about an incident and its relationship to safety culture, I can certainly see that there be areas within a safety culture model which maybe could be refocused. So we've talked about occupational safety versus process safety. It may be that we want to relook at process safety issues and identify specific things associated with process safety culture issues. And we might want to look at things such as how investment decisions and are there safety culture issues associated with how investment decisions are made. Those are the types of things that I could think of as being things that might come out of a particular incident that might indicate that there are other things to look at.
Thanks, Rich. I'm going, just Dr. Schulman, you have your hand raised, but I think that was from earlier, right?
No, I did have a question.
Oh,
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to raise a perspective that maybe people haven't talked about yet, and that is in this process of developing safety culture assessments and their impact on the regulatory process, it's very important, I think, that the regulator also develop and enhance its own capacity to understand, assess, and look at the safety culture in the organizations it's regulating and trying to regulate. And one of the dimensions of this is in its actual ability to observe behavior. I noticed that the comprehensive plan, the first year, is very thin on behavioral observations. And other than whatever can be done, I guess, by Dr. Cooper. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a very interesting strategy for safety culture regulation. It allows the utilities to create their own safety culture assessment teams. But it also has a reliance on its inspectors. It has one of the most comprehensive inspection forces there is in a regulatory agency. It has 2 resident inspectors who are assigned to every nuclear plant and fuel processing facility that it regulates. They are there full time. They watch, they observe. And one of the things that the NRC does is it asks its regulators for a plant that's being assessed to offer their own behavioral assessments of what they've actually seen. And they are there for quite a long time, and they have some observations. And those not only are obviously potentially useful to this assessment team, but they also allow the experience and the information about safety culture to grow in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission itself. So it seems to me that that would be something you might want to consider as use this process, not to just stand aside and let independent assessors or the utilities do it all themselves, but to improve your own resident capacity to assess and understand issues in safety culture. Now I'm taking my hand away.
Thank you, Dr. Schulman. We actually, oh,
Yeah,
go
I'll
ahead,
just
Rich.
make one comment on that. That's a great comment, and I'll just make a comment about our deliberations regarding what role does the CPUC play, and it is an important question of what expertise do we need within the CPUC, and how do we really interact with the utilities on an ongoing basis? I think you raise a very good question.
All right. So I think that was all of the questions that we had raised hands from or from the chat. And so I'm going to move on to our next section of the workshop, which is a facilitated discussion, and then we'll talk about next steps. So we have about 40 minutes left, and we have some questions here to prompt our discussion. And we can continue to structure our discussion in the same way that we did the discussion we just had. So if you have responses to questions, and you can either raise your hand or you can type in the chat. So the first question is just like a temperature check on the two scheduling options that we proposed, which is whether or not to synchronize the assessments so that all utilities are on the same schedule, or whether to stagger the assessments so that they're aligned with RAMP. We also wanted to allow this opportunity for people to say if they had other ideas of the timing and schedule for the assessments. So I'll pause and see if there's any hands or chat for the responses to this. Ken, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Emma. I think it'd be helpful also if we just, not to overstate the obvious, but just to give a background of why we're doing this on these questions. We really haven't mentioned this so far, but all of this is required by state legislation. There is some crossover on a couple of these pieces. As most of you know, SB 901 requires all electric utilities to do a safety culture assessment by a third party at least once every 5 years. And one of this, one thing we're talking about in this first bullet is, should it be staggered to align with the RAMP, which is pretty much once every 4 years. The other part of it that Sarah Moore talked about at the beginning is that OEIS, that office is required to do a safety culture assessment annually for each electric utility. So both of these pieces of legislation that started all this are focused on the electric side because their base interest was with wildfires, mostly caused with the electric side. What this rulemaking does, though, includes gas and electric. And what we're trying to do here is to reconcile all these pieces for gas and electric to avoid as much duplication as possible, to make the ask on the utilities as simple as possible. It's a big ask, but to make it as simple as possible, and to, like I said, reconcile the OEIS annual report, the once every 5 years or possibly 4 years third-party assessment, and also to include the gas side as well as electric.
You can for that clarification. Paul, Dr. Schulman, I see that you have your hand raised.
Just an observation with respect to aligning this with the RAMP, and then there was another thought about aligning it further into the general rate case. And I think in the long run, it would be very useful for assessments to find their way into approvals or not approvals of safety investments. But in the short run, I believe that it would be a very unfortunate thing to align closely now a safety culture assessment in the utility with a rate case. That will introduce incentives on the utilities that are not necessarily in the direction of having good objective safety culture assessments. It raises the stakes on the findings, and people are likely to be motivated, possibly to skew them. Secondly, in the current ramp system, you have an assessment of risk spend efficiency that has hardly any organizational and managerial variables involved. And I don't know how that's going to be integrated, but I think the risk of asking people to quantify things which move them out of reliable measurement is really high to do that. So this is, in a sense, an R&D process to put stakes, to make stakes higher, it seems to me, is to invite real risks of actually distorting the process.
Thank you, Dr. Schulman, for those comments. If other people have feedback on the pros and cons of the different options, feel free to raise your hand. All right. So it seems like maybe we can move on to the next question, which is, regardless of which option is chosen, should all utilities conduct a baseline or initial assessment in 2023? And when I say large utilities, for this context, I mean the 4 large electric and gas utilities. Super.
Hi, can I just really make a comment and kind of ask people to really consider this one seriously? And basically, the quicker we get going, the quicker we can validate, the quicker we can find out that we're on the right track and that we're helping the industry. Obviously helping California reduce the wildfires at the end of the day and so on. So I would just urge and make a plea for, please give us the assent that you would be willing to participate in these assessments in 2023. Thank you.
Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually follow up on Professor Schulman's question earlier about whether or not a baseline was, whether we were ready to do baseline, and whether or not we needed some more information. I'm not quite sure. I completely understand how you envision kind of collecting data without doing a baseline. So if you have any comments on conducting a baseline now versus kind of gathering information, I'd like to hear what your comments are in that regard. Did that make sense, Professor Schulman?
Oh, okay. So you asked me. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
Regarding
it
the
does.
should a baseline be done now, or do we need to collect more information before doing a baseline? Back to your previous comment.
Right. Well, I guess I think that I don't think you need a baseline first before you start gathering. I mean, you may need it before you start gathering additional information, but you need to make sure the baseline is actually sensible. And so I guess I would say, I know it's important to get started, and that should be happening. And I think, you know, on the other hand, you have to balance that, and you probably can do this, you practitioners, better than I can for sure, whether or not you are going to introduce error into the some of the basic assumptions about the culture that is then going to follow through and ramify in judgments about whether progress is or isn't being made. And so it just seems to me that to come up with, first off, to call it a comprehensive baseline is, I think, also a little bit too ambitious. And basically, the idea that you will cover equally all of the dimensions of a safety culture with assessments is probably a bit too ambitious. I think you should try to get as much as you can and do as much as you can, but to recognize that this is a baseline, and you know, I think we'll reassess it in the fourth year. It might be worthwhile to think about constantly assessing it as you move along. It's the only answer I can actually give at this point.
That's helpful, Dr. Cooper. Thank you. It sounds like we need to think at the very least about what we're calling things, and to make sure that we acknowledge that we're sort of like learning as we go. I see that Sarah Lee, you have your hand raised.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Sarah from Edison. I think I'm just looking so far at the sort of developments of this proceeding. Partially, I think before we answer some of these questions, there's a question about whether or not we'll have an opportunity to look at maybe a staff proposal or sort of a preliminary outline of both the model that's being used. I think I see the slides. That's helpful, but maybe, you know, we're being asked to react in real time to things that are being presented to us like today, and it's a lot of information to digest. So just wondering if, you know, conceptually, will we have opportunity in this proceeding to weigh in on these items, you know, and all the questions. You know, there's just a lot that we want to gather and synthesize and try to understand. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, we'll definitely have time after, so after the fourth workshop next week, then we'll release some, we'll release like our like concept paper for the topics that are discussed in workshop 3 and workshop 4, and then we'll ask for written feedback on those topics. So I recognize that it's difficult to respond on the spot.
Sorry, one more item. It's not just I feel like the concept paper, from what I understood from the recently released ruling, is that the concept paper is just a summary of the previous 2 workshop conversations. But certainly I think maybe the actual model itself, the outcomes, the expectations, the concept of what will the inputs then be used to do, how will it be improved over time. You know, if the model's not perfect, how do you expect that to understand that and then calibrate accordingly? You know, things like that.
Definitely. Yeah, I do think that some of that will be discussed in the fourth workshop and then would be in the concept paper that results from it. But we're still going to go by the proceeding timeline that was proposed in the scoping memo, which included that we would release like our actual staff proposal in late summer, early fall, and then there would be time to respond to the full proposal as well. So I think that there will, like, we're just trying to do like, because like you said, it's so much information at once, we're trying to do to gather feedback like as we go, but we'll have like an opportunity at the end of all the workshops after the draft staff proposal is developed to ask for feedback again.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna move on to the last question really quickly, and then we can talk about next steps. So the last question that we have is, are there additional ways the CPUC assessment should be coordinated with annual energy safety assessments? So if people have any initial feedback on that, then that would be helpful to share at this time. Okay, and I wanted to also pause to see if Commissioner Houck, if you had any questions that you wanted to ask parties before we conclude our discussion session.
I don't have any specific questions. I wasn't sure. It looked like Sarah Lee and Dr. Cooper had their hands up. I didn't know if they had comments on this question or if it looks like maybe they were left up from the other one. No, I do not have any questions.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Houck. So if people have questions as I continue, feel free to put them in the chat or continue to raise their hand, and I will stop. So I've already said this a couple times, but our anticipated next steps. So we have a workshop next Thursday from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. and we will send out an agenda and materials for that workshop in advance, and then instructions for providing written feedback on the topics that we discussed in the third workshop today, and the fourth technical working group meeting next week will be sent after the July 28th meeting, so likely in early August. And with that, I will pass it back to Commissioner. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Schulman. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Schulman. Can you hear me?
Okay. During that 9 to 3 period, do you plan to have a break of any kind in the middle for maybe lunch or something like that?
Definitely.
That's the best question of the day.
We definitely will. I know. We'll likely have an hour-long lunch break, and then like a morning break and an afternoon break. And if we don't end up needing that entire time that's allocated, then we'll also include that in our email to the service list that we send next week. But good question. I feel like we maybe needed a 5-minute break in this meeting too. And I will pass it on to Commissioner Houck if you have any closing remarks.
Thank you, Emma. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today for the third technical working group in this rulemaking. Again, I apologize for coming in late. I appreciate everyone's participation, our experts that we have here today, as well as the parties. These workshops are very important, and I'm looking forward to continuing these discussions, specifically in continuing discussions on how we're going to move forward in coordinating with energy safety, who's conducting their own annual safety assessments, and how we can continue to collaborate and work together to support mechanisms that lead to better outcomes. I want to also thank Administrative Law Judge Rizzo, Ben Turner, Saeed Bakri, Emma Johnson of Safety Policy Division for all of their work. Without them, we would not be having these workshops. They're doing an excellent job, so thank you. I also want to thank Candace Cho, my safety advisor, for all of her work on preparing for today's workshop and making sure that I was prepared for today. And also want to thank Energy Safety for their participation. Again, the goal of today's workshop was to consider methods to ensure that the safety culture assessments are complementary to the annual assessments conducted by Energy Safety, and determine where and how the safety culture assessments will fit into the existing safety and GRC review cycles. This was a good initial discussion as we begin to consider these issues within the proceeding. And as we near the end of our workshop series, I want to again thank everyone for participating. Look forward to continuing to work with all the parties throughout the proceeding as we continue to further and expand these discussions, and look forward to our fourth workshop in this series. And we'll conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner Hauk. Christine, I'm sorry I missed your hand earlier, but is the question that you had the same as the question that you put in the chat? Which was, is there a possibility to preview the workshop materials ahead of Friday? Still here. Okay, I'll go ahead and answer your question. Yes, we will try to send the materials out in advance for this last one. Sorry, we didn't do that for this working group meeting. And if there are, I wanted to pause again and to see if there are any additional questions. Dr. Schulman, I think is your hand from earlier? I think so. Oh. All right. That's everything that we have for today. So thank you all again for joining us on this Friday afternoon, and we hope to see you next Thursday at our last technical working group meeting. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Emma.